Science declared his death at exactly 1:21 a.m. But for the man who spent 40 years proving the soul was a myth, the experiment was only just beginning in the suffocating silence of the void.
For more than 30 years, Dr. Aris lived within a fortress of pure, unadulterated logic, a sanctuary built of silicon, steel, and empirical data. To him, the human soul was an embarrassing fairy tale, a desperate and pathetic hallucination created by a biological brain terrified of its own inevitable and messy expiration. As a world-renowned pioneer in neurobiology, he viewed every complex human emotion, from the sacrificial, blinding love of a mother for her child to the paralyzing, primitive fear of death, as nothing more than a precise, predictable sequence of neurotransmitters firing across a dark synaptic gap. He had stood over countless open skulls in his career, mapping the pulsating gray matter like a cold cartographer of the mundane, absolutely convinced that once the electricity stopped, the person simply ceased to exist. There was no ghost in the machine for Aris. There was only the machine, and eventually, every machine breaks down into scrap metal and silent wires. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in trauma, chemical decay, and the absolute, crushing finality of biological failure. Aris wore his atheism like a laboratory coat, sterile, white, and protective against the germs of superstition. He prided himself on what he called his cold precision, often openly mocking colleagues or students who dared to suggest that there might be a conscious observer hidden behind the eyes, something that couldn't be weighed on a scale or measured with an MRI. For him, life was a brutal, indifferent equation that always, without exception, ended in zero. This cynicism was not just a professional stance or a scientific methodology. It was a massive wall he had spent decades building to keep the chaotic darkness of the world at bay, unaware that with every brick of logic he laid, he was sealing himself into a tomb of his own making. His personal relationships were as sterile and controlled as his laboratory. He analyzed his family members like biological specimens, dissecting their motives and flaws with a clinical detachment that left him in a state of emotional starvation. He was a man who knew the molecular weight of a tear but had never felt the weight of the grief that produced it. The final night of his earthly tenure began in the very place where he felt most powerful, most like a god, his private, high-tech isolation laboratory. He was conducting what he believed to be his magnum opus, a high-stakes experiment on total sensory deprivation. His goal was to prove, once and for all, that without external stimuli to feed the brain, the concept of the soul would simply dissolve into meaningless static, proving that consciousness was entirely dependent on the material world. At 1:14 a.m., Aris's laboratory was silent. The experiment involved the use of heavy sedatives to induce a controlled biological shutdown. The objective was to record the exact moment consciousness ceased, treating his own body as a test subject. Aris was wired to electrodes and infusion pumps, trusting the precision of machines not to cross the critical threshold. The system failed. His body, worn down by years of stress and neglect, could not handle the chemical load. His blood pressure dropped rapidly. Aris tried to reach the emergency switch, but the drugs had already paralyzed his reflexes. The heart attack came without warning. He died alone while the monitors coldly recorded the shutdown of his organs. His vision collapsed into a tunnel of static and went dark. At 1:21 a.m., brain activity stopped. To the medical team that would arrive later, there was nothing more than a lifeless body slumped in a chair. But death did not bring the blackout he expected. The instant his heart stopped, Aris felt a violent separation. An unseen force pulled him downward, a gravity that acted directly on his consciousness. There was no light, no peaceful transition, only a rapid descent into a dense, freezing plane of existence. I spent my entire life dissecting brains to prove the soul was a lie. The moment my blood stopped, I realized I had been building my own prison of ice. The fall ended in a lightless reality. The cold was absolute. Aris found himself trapped in a place that defied physics, a void that behaved like a structure of total isolation. He was suspended in it, unable to move, unable to escape. The darkness around him felt aware. It wasn't empty, it was observing him. A sterile, clinical gaze pressing in from all directions. Aris was no longer the observer, he was the specimen. There was no explanation, no voice, no guide, only a crushing presence, one that mirrored the emptiness of the life he had lived. Listen carefully. Living under the belief that nothing matters increases the weight of your own condemnation. The abyss doesn't need fire. It uses the void you spent your life creating within yourself. This is a high-stakes game with eternity, and it only ends one way: defeat. There is a strategy to break this cycle before it's too late. The battle plan is in the pinned comment. Do not let the void be the place where you finally realize you were wrong. The silence in the darkness was not empty. It carried a low vibration that pulsed through Aris's awareness. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping that felt like a physical blow against his spirit. With every beat, waves of raw emotion washed over him. These were not his own feelings. For the first time, Aris was forced to experience the exact pain and coldness that others had felt in his presence during his life. In his laboratory, Aris had prided himself on being emotionally unreachable. He viewed the grief of others as a biological malfunction. In this place, that indifference was turned against him. The darkness forced him to feel the crushing weight of his own actions. He felt the sharp rejection his daughter experienced when he chose his work over her life. It wasn't a memory, it was the actual hollow ache in her chest, and the moment she realized her father did not love her. This pressure felt like being buried under a mountain of lead. I spent my life looking down at people from a throne of titles and degrees. I thought my coldness was a sign of intellectual strength. Now every moment of silence I gave to those who needed me has become a weight that is dragging me into the floor of this void. The vibration grew into a roar of voices, the echoes of students he had humiliated and patients he had dismissed as mere biological machines. Aris felt the freezing, clinical touch of his own hands, as if he were the victim on the table. He felt the terrifying loneliness of the dying patients he had ignored during his rounds. Their silent pleas for connection became burning needles stitching into his essence. He had denied them time to save his own, and now that stolen time was being used to torture him. The darkness took on a solid, invasive texture. There was no privacy for his ego here. Every dismissive look and every thought of superiority was broadcast back to him with the intensity of a desert sun. His arrogance had gained physical mass, a thick, oily sludge that filled his senses and pulled him deeper into the pit. He tried to retreat into his mind, but the void was his mind. There was no escaping the character he had built for 80 years. He saw the impressions of the people he had failed. Their eyes were distant and frozen, watching him with absolute judgment. He felt a frantic urge to apologize, but words have no value in this realm. He realized that the nothingness he preached in his lectures was a lie. This place was a perfect, terrifying mirror. I told my students we were just chemicals and stardust. Now, as I drown in the pain of others, I see that we are actually a debt. Every time I was cruel or cold, I was just increasing a bill that I must now pay with my own agony. The pressure of this resonance felt like being ground between two stones. He felt the literal cold of the hospital rooms he had walked through without offering a word of comfort. That cold was now inside his marrow, a permanent frost that no fire could reach. Aris was a monument to his own indifference. The attendants appeared, shadows in tattered lab coats with faces of polished bone. They didn't need force. The weight of Aris's own character kept him pinned to the invisible table. They moved with slow precision, their hands glowing with a sickly light that smelled of old dust and ozone. I thought I was the one who studied the world. But these things are weighing my heart, and they found it weighs less than a single breath. I am a vacuum, and they are here to fill me with everything I spent a lifetime running away from. An attendant placed a hand over his chest. It felt like an industrial suction pump. Aris felt his pride and his academic titles being ripped out of him, leaving a hollow hole that the darkness immediately filled with the black ink of regret. He was being stripped of his mask. The next stage was the total dismantling of the man he claimed to be. The shadow attendants moved Aris further into the void. This was not a movement through space, but a transition into a deeper level of reality. He felt himself being placed on a cold, invisible surface that vibrated with the low hum of 1,000 judgmental whispers. He began to call this place the laboratory of truth. Here, the mask he had worn for 80 years, the professional titles, the arrogance, and the calculated indifference began to peel away like dead skin. The atmosphere was thick and heavy, smelling of old blood and the stagnant air of a place where light had never existed. In this stage, the darkness changed. A sharp, piercing light began to radiate from the void itself. This light did not show his physical form. It exposed his motives. Aris felt his mind being unrolled. Every decision he ever made was laid bare, but it was the ugly truth behind those decisions that burned. He saw that his dedication to science was often just a coward's excuse to avoid the emotional needs of his wife. He saw that his most brilliant lectures were fueled by a hunger for the applause of students, not a desire to help humanity. The light acted like a scalpel, cutting through the layers of his ego with a cold, indifferent precision that made his very essence shiver. I spent my life believing I held the light of reason for others. In this place, I see that my light was just a flickering match against a hurricane of vanity. I wasn't searching for truth. I was searching for a way to be superior to it. The attendants began a procedure that felt like the extraction of his memories. A cold, metallic pressure pushed against his temples. Suddenly, he wasn't just watching his past. He was being consumed by it. He felt the crushing weight of the silence he had used to punish his colleagues. He felt the hollow emptiness of the nights he spent alone in his office, choosing his reputation over the warmth of a human hand. The attendants pulled these memories out of him and fed them back into his awareness. He was forced to digest the reality of his own choices. It was a spiritual nausea, a sickness of the soul that made him want to collapse. But the invisible straps of his own character held him perfectly still. He watched as the monuments of his life, his published books, his medals, the buildings with his name on them, turned into ash. None of it had any mass here. None of it could shield him from the shivering cold. He realized that he had spent his entire life accumulating things that had a value of 0 in this realm. The nothingness he had predicted was true in only one way. Everything he had valued was now nothing. He stood naked in a storm of his own making, and the only thing he had brought across the threshold was the coldness he used to keep people away. That coldness was now a solid wall of ice surrounding his heart. I thought death would be a quiet room where I could finally rest. There is no rest here because there is no silence. The silence I created in life has become a roaring wind that screams my name. It reminds me of every word I should have said. I am being dismantled by the very things I thought made me a man. The attendants then performed what felt like a transplant of awareness. Aris was forced to inhabit the perspective of a young medical student he had once humiliated in front of a full lecture hall. He felt the heat of the boy's shame and the stinging tears he had tried to hide. He saw how that single act of cruelty had hardened the student's heart, making him less kind to his own future patients. Aris felt the ripple effect of his arrogance. He saw how his vanity had traveled through time, infecting hundreds of other lives with his own poison. This was the true anatomy of his life, a trail of broken spirits. The darkness began to fill with a thick black fluid. It rose slowly around the invisible table, covering his legs and chest. It didn't drown him, but it suffocated his pride. Every drop of the liquid felt like a heavy, cold coin, the price of his indifference. He felt the liquidation of his soul. The solid parts of his personality were melting into this black sludge. He was losing his name and his excuses. He was being reduced to a single point of awareness, a tiny spark being overwhelmed by a dark ocean of the lives he had touched without love. I am not being punished by a judge. I am being punished by the law of my own nature. I made myself a vacuum, and now the universe is filling that void with everything I rejected. I am drowning in the truth of who I was. There isn't enough air in eternity to satisfy the debt I owe to the living. As the black liquid reached his eyes, the shadow attendants leaned over him. Their featureless masks reflected the history of the suffering Aris had witnessed but never shared. He felt an agonizing pull at the center of his being, as if a hook were being driven into his essence. They were preparing to move him from the laboratory of truth to the ward of eternal echoes. The scientist who once looked through a microscope and saw only chemistry now looked into the void and saw the infinite complexity of a single human regret. The floor seemed to dissolve, and Aris sank deeper into the abyss. The cold was no longer around him. It was him. He was a creature made of frost and shadow. The symphony of resonance from the previous ward was gone, replaced by a single sound, the heartbeat of the universe he had denied. That heartbeat was now the only clock he would ever follow. He was no longer the architect. He was the debris. The experiment is over. The data is in. The conclusion is more terrifying than any hell I could have imagined. I existed, but I never lived. Now I have to exist forever with the memory of a life I threw away just to be right. The descent from the laboratory did not lead to an end, but to a vast, desolate space that Aris began to recognize as the chamber of infinite memory. Here, the darkness was no longer a wall. It was an ocean of thin, silver threads stretching into infinity. Each thread represented a life he had touched or influenced. As he drifted through them, he realized with a sickening clarity that his coldness was a virus. He was being forced to watch it spread through time, long after his body had been buried. His influence did not die with him. It lived on as a shadow over others. He was pulled toward a cluster of threads that glowed with a bruised, sickly purple light. These were the memories of his own children. Aris was forced to witness the years following his death. He saw his son struggling to show affection to his own family because Aris had never shown him how to be a father. He felt the cold silence in his son's home, a direct inheritance from the sterile, silent dinners Aris had enforced. He watched his daughter fall into a series of destructive relationships, seeking the approval she never received from him. Every tear they shed felt like a hot coal pressed against his spirit. He wasn't just watching their pain, he was the source of it. I thought I was leaving behind a legacy of knowledge and a name that would be honored. But looking at the wreckage of my children's lives, I see my real legacy as a trail of broken hearts. I didn't build a monument. I built a desert, and now my own family is dying of thirst in the wasteland I created. The shadow attendants appeared again, but they did not touch him. They simply pointed toward the silver threads. Aris felt his awareness being stretched thin, like wire being pulled through a needle. He was forced to experience the long-term impact of his professional arrogance. He saw a doctor he had trained to be objective and detached. He watched as that doctor committed a series of medical errors because he had stopped seeing his patients as people, viewing them only as the biological machines Aris had described. He felt the grief of the families destroyed by those mistakes. He realized that a portion of that grief was his own debt. He was the root of the tree, and every bitter fruit it produced was his responsibility. The cold in this chamber was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of heat, it was the total absence of hope. Aris tried to intervene, to whisper a word of comfort to his daughter or a warning to the young doctor, but he was a ghost. He could see everything but touch nothing. The realization that he was powerless to fix the damage he had caused was a torture worse than the physical cold. His brilliance, which had been his shield in life, was now a spotlight that illuminated every failure in detail. He could feel the vibrations of regret in every thread he was forced to touch. In my lab, I said that only data survives. I was wrong. Data is dead. It is the ripples of kindness or cruelty that survive. I spent 80 years accumulating data and 0 years accumulating kindness. Now I am drowning in the ripples of my own cruelty, and I see that a single cold word can travel for centuries, freezing everything it touches. The chamber began to fill with a low, mournful sound, like 1,000 instruments playing a single discordant note. It was the sound of everything he had left unfinished. He felt the weight of every apology he had postponed and every moment of time he had promised his wife but never gave. These unfulfilled intentions manifested as heavy gray stones that piled up around him, pinning him to the floor of the void. He was being buried by the weight of the man he could have been. He saw a version of his life where he had been kind, and the contrast between that golden reality and his current existence made him want to scream until his soul shattered. The black fluid from the previous ward began to seep into this chamber, but it was thicker now, like tar. It coated the silver threads of his legacy, turning his influence into a suffocating mess. He watched as the awards he had won were melted by the acidity of this fluid. His name on the university buildings began to crumble because the foundation, his character, was rotten. He understood then that the eternal life he sought through his work was a sham. He was being forgotten by the living, and the only place he truly remained was in the wounds he had left in the souls of others. I thought I was a giant among men. But here, in the shadow of the truth, I see I was just a small, frightened man who used big words to hide his emptiness. I am being erased from the world I loved and written into a book of shadows where every page is a memory of someone I failed. The shadow attendants approached, their featureless faces reflecting the tar-coated threads of his life. One held up a mirror, but Aris saw no face. He saw a vacuum, a vortex of gray mist and cold wind. He realized that after 80 years, he had failed to create a self that could survive the light of eternity. He was just a collection of titles and habits, and now that those were gone, there was nothing left but the cold. He was a hollow vessel, and the void was finally claiming its own. The chamber began to tilt, and Aris felt himself sliding toward a dark opening in the floor, the entrance to the final extraction. He knew this was where the last remnants of his ego would be removed, leaving only the raw essence of his debt. He looked back at the threads of his children's lives one last time, reaching out with a phantom hand, but the tar-like liquid pulled him down. He was leaving the chamber of memory and entering a place where even memory would be a luxury he could not afford. The most terrifying thing about this place is that it is fair. I am getting exactly what I built. I spent my life creating a world without a soul, and now that is exactly where I have to stay. I am the architect of my own damnation, and I have done a perfect job. The slide into the opening in the floor felt like being dragged through a throat of crushed ice. Aris was no longer falling. He was being buried by the weight of every truth he had ever denied. This was the bottom of the void. The air here was thick, stagnant, and tasted of ancient rust. It was the absolute end of the line, the place where the arrogance of his entire life was about to be permanently erased, leaving behind only the shivering essence of a man who chose to be a vacuum. He was placed on a cold, black platform. The shadow attendants gathered around him in a perfect, silent circle. One of them stepped forward and struck the platform. A sound erupted that was so pure and terrifyingly loud, it felt like it was tearing Aris's soul into microscopic fragments. With every vibration of that sound, a layer of his remaining identity was violently stripped away. The memory of his awards, his degrees, and his pride shook loose and dissolved into the dark air. The attendants were cleaning the clutter of his life to see what was left at the center. When the layers fell away, There was nothing but a tiny, flickering spark of gray light surrounded by cold emptiness. He was a hollow shell. The black, tar-like liquid from the previous wards began to rise one last time. It crawled up his legs, his chest, and reached his throat. Aris felt his consciousness being integrated into the walls of that abyss. He was about to become a silent, permanent echo in the dark, a warning for those who would follow his footsteps of pride and apathy. The liquid covered his eyes. The absolute absence of hope settled over him. He was gone. Then a massive, violent force ripped through the dark. It was not a light, and it was not a rescue from an angel. It was a brutal, physical explosion that shattered the frozen architecture of the void. The black liquid was instantly vaporized by a shock wave of raw electricity. Aris was pulled upward with a speed that felt like his spirit was being torn in half. The cold silence of the abyss was replaced by a deafening, chaotic noise. Aris opened his eyes and screamed. He didn't wake up peacefully. He woke up thrashing on the floor of his laboratory, his chest burning with the agony of broken ribs. Blinding fluorescent lights stabbed his eyes. A paramedic was pressing a defibrillator against his chest, yelling clear. A colleague had found him slumped in the chair and called the emergency line. It was 1:28 a.m. Aris had been dead for exactly 7 minutes, but those 7 minutes in the physical world were an eternity in the void. As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, Aris did not ask about his heart or his lab equipment. He simply grabbed the arm of the young medic, his hands shaking violently, and began to weep. It was a raw, ugly, uncontrollable weeping that shocked everyone in the room. The man of stone was shattered. The documentary of Dr. Aris does not end with his death, but with the terrifying reality of his survival. He spent the next 3 weeks in intensive care, staring at the ceiling, terrified to fall asleep. When he was finally discharged, he was a ghost of his former self. He never returned to the laboratory. He resigned from his prestigious positions, abandoned his research, and walked away from the empire of logic he had spent 40 years building. For the rest of his life, Aris lived with the memory of the cold. It was a chill that no blanket and no heater could ever remove. He sold his massive estate and gave the money to the families of the patients he had treated with indifference. He spent his days desperately trying to reconnect with his children, enduring their initial anger and confusion with a humble patience he had never shown before. He knew he could not erase the desert he had created in their lives, but he spent every remaining breath trying to plant a single seed of warmth in the wreckage. People whispered that the lack of oxygen had damaged his brain. His former colleagues mocked him, calling him a broken old man who had surrendered to the very fairy tales he used to destroy. Aris never defended himself. He accepted their mockery in silence, knowing that their laughter sounded exactly like the arrogant echoes he had heard in the dark. He knew what waited for them, and he prayed every day that they would wake up before their own blood stopped flowing. Aris lived for another 12 years. He died quietly in his sleep, holding his daughter's hand. He spent his final decade not as a master of science, but as a man desperately paying off a massive spiritual debt. He learned that the only thing that survives the end of the flesh is the love you gave and the pain you caused.